Good morning, everyone. Merry Christmas. So this is a Christmas story, of course, that happened long ago across a great ocean from here in the land called Israel. And it was a dark winter night, and there were hundreds of sheep asleep in the field that night. And it was all quiet except for the occasional bleat of a sheep. And there were a few shepherds there, and they were gazing up at the night sky. The stars were twinkling frosty in the sky that night. And there was an old shepherd named Elias. He had spent his whole life out in these fields, ever since he was a boy. And there was a young man, 20 years old, named Judas. And Judas, he was kind of a grumpy young man. And you can understand why. Come on forward, you guys, all the way up. The shepherds were out in the field that night, and the young boy, Judas, his father and his uncle had been captured by the Roman soldiers. You see, the Romans had come to Israel, and they had taken his father and his uncle, and they had put him in prison for almost no reason at all. And Judas was angry about that, and he wished that someone would come, a great king perhaps, or a master. Some called him the Messiah. And he wished that he would come and drive the Romans out of their land. And he was looking sadly at the sheep that were sleeping before him on the fields that night. And he said to Elias, the lambs will die soon, but the ewes, the mother sheep, will live on. And old Elias, he couldn't hear very well. He said, "What?" He was getting kind of old. And so Judas said again, the lambs will be sheared next summer, or the ewes will be sheared, but the lambs will be sacrificed in the temple at Passover. And he said, "Lamps and bears? What?" And then he said right into his ear, he said, "The lambs, they'll die at Passover in the temple." "Oh," Elias said, "Passover." He said, "Passover." He said, "I wish I could have been there that first Passover. The great master Moses was there. He saved our people." You see, angels of God had come to drive evil out of Egypt, and they passed over the Jewish people because of their love for God. And he looked at the lambs, and he said, they'll sacrifice the lambs in the temple at Passover. That was the job of the shepherds, was to raise these lambs for sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, which was close to there. There was also a little shepherd boy, just a boy nearby, and he was resting and listening to Judas and Elias speak. And he said, sadly, "I don't think I'd like to be a lamb." And then they were quiet, and they huddled with their cloaks against the cold winter night, and they lay there looking out at the dark, twinkling sky. They were used to the blackness of the night out there and the cold. And they kept their eyes out for thieves and for wolves so they wouldn't lose any of their sheep. When all of a sudden, the light filled the sky like 1,000 or 1,000,000 oil lamps were burning so brightly they were blinded by its brilliance. And when they could finally see, there was a man who had come down from the sky, and he was all full of light. He was dressed in light. His face was shining with light. And he said in a voice like ringing bells, he said, "Do not be afraid." And they couldn't speak. They looked at this man, and he said, "Tonight," he said, "the Messiah is born. Here in the town of David," that was Bethlehem where they were. He said, "The Son of David is born, the deliverer." And Judas said, "The Messiah has come at last to save our people." But they couldn't speak. And the angel, this man full of light, he said, "You will know by this sign, the baby is born in a manger here in the town of David." And they thought, what a strange sign. But still they could not speak. For all of a sudden, as the angel lifted his arms, there were hundreds, thousands of angels filling the sky. Millions of angels, whole armies and kingdoms of God's angels filled the sky. And they began to sing. In one great voice of joy and love, they sang out, "Glory to God," they sang. "Glory to God in the highest." Over and over again they sang with so much joy. The sound echoed over the valleys like thunder and rumbled like a great waterfall tumbling over the towns until it filled the whole world with that love of God and the angels. And they sang, and the shepherds sang. Their hearts were filled with wonder. They were crying with joy until finally the singing began to fade. And the angels too began to fade from the night sky, slowly at first, until only the twinkling of the stars was left in the sky above them. Still they could not speak for a long time. Finally, old Elias spoke up and he said, "My friends," he said, "we have witnessed what our ancestors and the prophets only dreamed of." And all Judas could say was, "Angels." And the little shepherd boy, he said, "God's angels." And Elias said, "But something more." He said, "The angel spoke of a sign, a little manger with the Messiah child." See, there were many troughs where the cattle gathered outside Bethlehem, but there was only one manger that Elias could think of, in a little cave, in a stable just outside the town of Bethlehem. And before they could say another word, old Elias, he was fast for an old man. He took off running down the hill, flying with his cloak flapping behind him. And the shepherd boys, they took off after him. They could hardly keep up. And when they finally caught up, there he was at the entrance to the stable again with tears streaming down his face. He was looking inside. There was this glowing light. And of course, the little baby was there. And there were animals. And there was father and mother, Joseph and Mary gathered there. And there was the Christ child, a little Messiah born, shining like a star, like the sun, but with this peaceful light. And slowly, quietly, they went inside. And Elias, he looked at the mother. She was like an angel herself. He looked at the little Christ child shining like the sun. And the little shepherd boy, he said, "Angels, we saw hundreds, thousands of angels filling the sky, singing, 'Glory to God, the highest.' They told us of the Christ child." And old Elias looked at the mother and he said, "God has entrusted you with his own son, the son of David." And they stayed there for what felt like a very long time, until finally it was time to go. Elias said, "We will pray for you." And he motioned the shepherds. It was time to go. So quietly they left the stable. And of course they had seen the Christ, although they did not know it yet. And nor were they quiet about what they saw. They spoke to it and sang songs to everyone all over Bethlehem, and far across the land they heard of the Christ child being born that night. And the very best part, like old Elias said, is something more. You see, right now, the Christ child is being born again. Not as a little baby. Right now, he's being born as the Spirit of God's love in your own heart and in mine. And at Christmas time, and all over this world, that love of God and Christ is filling this earth and beyond with that infinite love of God forever. Blessed Christmas, everyone.
Did you all like the story?